The hum of fluorescent lights in the grocery store had become a soundtrack to Clara's life. Every Tuesday afternoon, she wandered the same aisles, filling her cart with the same items: a loaf of sourdough, a carton of eggs, a bag of salad greens she often forgot to eat. It was a ritual, predictable and safe, much like the rest of her existence. At 54, Clara's life was quiet. Her children were grown, busy with their families and careers. Her marriage had ended amicably years ago, leaving her with an empty home and a calendar that mocked her with blank spaces. She had friends, of course, but their conversations often revolved around grandchildren or health complaints, and she found herself retreating inward more often than not. That day at the grocery store felt no different, until she reached for a can of crushed tomatoes on the top shelf. Her fingers barely grazed the rim when a hand appeared next to hers. "Let me get that for you," a voice said, smooth and warm like freshly brewed coffee. Startled, Clara turned to see a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a boyish grin that could have belonged to someone half his age. He wore a simple plaid shirt and jeans, but there was an easy confidence in the way he moved, the way he smiled at her like they'd known each other forever. "Oh, thank you," she stammered, feeling the warmth of a blush creeping up her neck. She hadn't blushed in years. "No problem," he replied, handing her the can. "You've got good taste. That brand makes the best marinara." She laughed, the sound foreign even to her own ears. "Good to know. Maybe I'll finally make something worth eating. You'll have to let me know how it turns out," he said with a wink before moving on, pushing a basket that contained little more than a carton of milk and a bunch of bananas. Clara watched him go, her heart fluttering in a way that felt both exhilarating and absurd. She didn't even know his name, but something about that brief interaction had left her feeling lighter, like a crack of sunlight had broken through her otherwise overcast days. She shook her head, chiding herself. It was nothing, just a stranger being kind. But as she finished her shopping and drove home, his voice and that smile lingered, turning her usual quiet evening into something slightly brighter. Clara didn't know it then, but that moment, simple, ordinary, was the beginning of something extraordinary. Something she hadn't even known her heart was still capable of. The next week, Clara found herself lingering a little longer in the produce aisle, her eyes darting up from a bin of apples at the sound of passing footsteps. She scolded herself for it. What was she even hoping for? That the man with the easy smile and warm voice might appear again. And then he did. "Back for more tomatoes," he teased, his voice instantly recognizable. Clara turned, caught off guard by how genuinely glad she was to see him. "Not this time," she replied, holding up a bag of apples. "Today's culinary adventure involves pie, though whether it'll be edible is another question." His grin widened. "Pie's always worth the gamble." He extended a hand. "I'm Lucas, by the way. Figured it's about time I introduced myself." "Clara," she said, shaking his hand and feeling a strange spark at the contact. "Nice to meet you, Lucas." They fell into an easy rhythm, chatting as they walked the aisles. Lucas was charming without trying, and Clara found herself laughing at his stories, like the time he burned an entire pot of chili trying to impress his friends, or the way his dog Max always managed to steal his socks. When they reached the checkout line, Clara hesitated, not wanting their conversation to end. But Lucas spoke first. "Hey, there's a coffee shop just around the corner," he said. "Would you want to grab a cup? Unless you're in a hurry." Clara's first instinct was to decline. It wasn't like her to say yes to spontaneous invitations, but something about Lucas made her feel safe, seen, and a little braver than usual. "I'd like that," she said, surprising even herself. At the coffee shop, they sat by the window, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the small table. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, spanning topics from favorite books to travel dreams. Lucas spoke with a curiosity about life that Clara hadn't encountered in years, and she realized how much she'd missed having someone genuinely interested in her thoughts. By the time they parted ways, Clara felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. It wasn't just the novelty of meeting someone new. It was the way Lucas made her feel. Interesting, vibrant, and for the first time in a long time alive. That night, as Clara curled up with a book, she realized she hadn't even glanced at the TV, a habit she developed to fill the silence. Instead, her mind kept returning to Lucas. His laugh, the way he listened, the warmth in his eyes. It was just a cup of coffee, she told herself. But deep down she knew it was something more. A seed had been planted in the quiet corners of her heart, and even though she tried to ignore it, she could feel it beginning to grow. Over the following weeks, Lucas became a steady presence in Clara's life. It started with chance encounters at the grocery store, but soon it was intentional: shared coffees, walks in the park, and even the occasional text message that lit up her phone in the middle of a quiet evening. Each time they met, Clara found herself looking forward to their conversations, savoring the way Lucas's energy seemed to fill the spaces she hadn't realized were so empty. He was inquisitive, thoughtful, and quick to laugh, his joy infectious in a way that made her feel younger, freer. One afternoon, they found themselves sitting on a bench overlooking the river, a warm breeze rustling the trees above. Lucas had been recounting a story about his misadventures in college, and Clara was laughing so hard tears streamed down her cheeks. "See, I knew you had a good laugh in you," he teased, handing her a tissue from his pocket. Clara dabbed at her eyes, still chuckling. "Well, you bring it out of me. Not many people do that these days." He gave her a soft look, one that made her stomach flutter. "That's a shame," he said simply. "You've got a beautiful laugh." Clara's breath caught. It was just a compliment, she told herself, but the way he said it felt different, like he truly meant it, like he truly saw her. That evening, as she stood in her kitchen slicing vegetables for a solitary dinner, the moment replayed in her mind. His words, his tone, the way her heart had skipped like she was a teenager all over again. She leaned against the counter, staring out the window as the truth slowly began to sink in. She liked him. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, sending a shockwave through her chest. How could this be? He was so much younger, and surely he only saw her as a friend, someone to share light-hearted moments with. Yet there it was, the truth she could no longer deny. Lucas had stirred something in her, something she hadn't felt in decades. A longing, a hope, a spark of life that she'd thought had faded with time. But with the realization came fear. What would he think if he knew? What would others think? Was she foolish to even entertain such feelings? She pushed the thoughts aside, determined to bury them. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her heart refused to listen. It beat with a quiet, insistent rhythm, whispering the truth she was too afraid to admit out loud. She was falling for Lucas, and no matter how much she tried to fight it, she couldn't help but wonder where this uncharted path might lead. Clara began to notice how her emotions ebbed and flowed with every interaction she had with Lucas. On one hand, she felt a joy she hadn't known in years, a kind of lightness that came from simply being around him. On the other, there was the weight of her doubts, pressing down with every passing day. What would people say? The thought lingered constantly in her mind. She was a 54-year-old woman, well past the age when romance was supposed to be exciting or new. Lucas was vibrant, in his early 30s, his whole life ahead of him. Surely he deserved someone who could match his youth and energy. And yet, whenever they were together, all those worries melted away. Like the evening they ran into each other at the park. She'd been walking the trail alone, lost in thought, when Lucas appeared, jogging toward her with his ever-present smile. "Hey, Clara," he called out, slowing to a walk. "Fancy meeting you here." They ended up sitting on a patch of grass by the lake, talking until the sky turned shades of orange and pink. Lucas told her about his latest project at work, his ambitions, and his love for spontaneous road trips. Clara listened intently, marveling at how alive he seemed, how he carried a kind of zest for life that she hadn't realized she missed in herself. "Do you ever think about just going somewhere?" he asked, lying back on the grass and staring at the sky. "No plans, no deadlines. Just you and the open road." She laughed softly, hugging her knees. "I think I used to a long time ago. But now, I wouldn't even know where to begin." Lucas sat up, his eyes locking on hers. "Maybe it's not about knowing where to begin. Maybe it's just about taking the first step." His words stayed with her long after they parted ways that evening. They echoed in her mind during quiet moments, when she sipped her morning coffee, when she folded laundry, when she lay awake at night staring at the ceiling. But alongside the warmth he brought her came the fear. Could she truly let herself feel this way? What if Lucas didn't feel the same? What if she misread everything? And even if he did, What about the judgment that would inevitably come from others? One afternoon, as Clara stood in front of her bathroom mirror, she caught her reflection and frowned. Her hands traced the faint lines around her eyes, the gray strands peeking through her dyed hair. She had always been confident in her own way, but now, all she could see were the signs of a woman whose best days fell behind her. "What are you doing, Clara?" she whispered to herself. "This isn't meant for you." But then she thought of Lucas. His laugh, his kindness, the way he made her feel like she was the most fascinating person in the world. For the first time in years, someone had seen her, really seen her, and treated her like she mattered. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. That night, as she sat on her porch under a canopy of stars, Clara let herself admit what she'd been fighting for weeks. She wanted more than friendship. She wanted to feel alive, to embrace whatever this was, even if it scared her. But was she brave enough to take the first step? Clara spent the next few days in an emotional tug-of-war. Her mind conjured every excuse to let things stay as they were. Their connection was safe in the realm of friendship, untainted by complications or the vulnerability of unspoken feelings. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore what was stirring in her heart. Lucas had become more than a friend. He was the first person in years who made her feel truly alive, and she wanted to take a step toward something real, even if it terrified her. One evening, as she stared at her phone, Clara wrestled with an idea that had been swirling in her mind since their last walk in the park. Cooking was her sanctuary, and she'd mentioned her love for trying new recipes to Lucas several times. Maybe, just maybe, she could invite him over for dinner. She rehearsed the words in her head a dozen times before finally typing them out. "Hi, Lucas. I was thinking of trying out a new recipe this weekend. Would you want to come over and be my taste tester? No pressure." Her finger hovered over the send button, her heart pounding. What if he said no? Worse, what if he thought the invitation was inappropriate? Before she could overthink it further, she hit send and set her phone down, pacing the room as anxiety bubbled up inside her. Minutes felt like hours until her phone chimed with a notification. "That sounds amazing, Clara. I'd love to. Just let me know when and what I can bring." She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, relief and excitement washing over her in equal measure. It was happening. The rest of the week was a blur of preparation. Clara cleaned her small home from top to bottom, rearranging furniture and lighting candles she hadn't touched in years. She carefully planned the menu: a roasted chicken with herbs, a seasonal salad, and an apple tart for dessert. As Saturday evening approached, Clara stood in front of her closet, second-guessing everything she owned. Nothing felt right. Too formal, too casual, too revealing. She finally settled on a simple blue dress that hugged her figure in just the right way, pairing it with a silver necklace that had been a gift from her late husband years ago. When the doorbell rang, her heart skipped a beat. She smoothed her dress and took a steadying breath before opening the door to find Lucas standing there, holding a bottle of wine and his signature grin. "Something smells incredible already," he said, stepping inside. Clara led him to the dining table, which she'd set with her best dishes. Lucas looked around, his expression warm. "This is perfect, Clara. You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," she said, smiling nervously. "I enjoy cooking for someone who appreciates it." As they sat down and began eating, the conversation flowed effortlessly as it always did. Lucas complimented every dish, and Clara couldn't help but blush at his praise. When dinner was over, they moved to the living room with glasses of wine, the atmosphere growing quieter, more intimate. Lucas leaned back on the couch, his eyes meeting hers with an openness that made her pulse quicken. "This is one of the best evenings I've had in a long time," he said softly. "Thank you for inviting me, Clara." Her heart swelled at his words. For a moment, the fear that had been haunting her felt distant, replaced by a warmth she hadn't known she could feel again. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to hope that this connection, this spark, might be the beginning of something she hadn't dared to dream of in years. Today, as the evening wore on, the space between Clara and Lucas seemed to shrink, their conversation becoming quieter, more intimate. The wine had loosened their tongues, but it was more than that. Something unspoken had shifted between them, an unacknowledged tension hanging in the air. They spoke of everything and nothing. shared memories, funny anecdotes from their past, even their deepest regrets. The more they talked, the more Clara realized how much they had in common, how many small, overlooked things tied their lives together in subtle ways. Lucas was genuinely interested in her. He listened with a depth that made Clara feel seen, heard, and valued. When he spoke, his words were soft but direct, and each sentence seemed to linger in the room, touching something inside her. Clara felt both grounded and weightless in his presence. At some point, they fell into a silence, just sitting next to each other, the faint hum of the city outside barely audible over the quiet of the night. Clara's breath quickened as she became acutely aware of him beside her. The warmth of his body just a few inches from hers, the subtle, intoxicating scent of his cologne. He turned toward her, his eyes soft and focused, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. Clara, Lucas said her name as if it were a secret only meant for them, his voice low, intimate. I have to tell you something. Her heart skipped, her pulse beating a little faster. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Then, with a small, almost nervous smile, he reached out and took her hand. The simple gesture sent a thrill through her chest. I've been thinking about you, he said, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. A lot. More than I probably should. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her thoughts tumbling over each other as she processed what he was saying. Lucas, She trailed off, her mind racing. She couldn't quite find the words. Was this real? Or was she imagining it? Before she could speak again, Lucas leaned in, closing the distance between them. His lips brushed her softly at first, tentative like a question. And when she didn't pull away, his kiss deepened, more urgent this time, as if he were showing her what words could never fully express. Clara's world tilted on its axis, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she surrendered. She kissed him back, her body instinctively leaning toward his, her hands finding their way to his chest. The feeling was overwhelming, intense, raw, but at the same time, tender. They pulled away slowly, their foreheads resting together, breathing heavily. Clara's heart raced, her thoughts a jumble of excitement, fear, and disbelief. What had just happened? Lucas smiled, his eyes searching hers with a softness that made her feel exposed in the most vulnerable way. Clara, he said again, his voice a murmur against her skin. I want this. I want you. Her chest tightened, both in fear and something much deeper. This moment, this connection, felt so fragile, so impossible in its beauty, but also in its risk. I don't know what this means, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I can't deny that I feel something, too. Lucas gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin in a slow, comforting rhythm. We don't have to figure everything out right now. I just know that I don't want to leave this moment. Clara closed her eyes, her breath steadying, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to lean into the unknown, to trust that maybe, just maybe, what had started as a spark could ignite into something more. The days after that evening passed in a kind of quiet daze. Clara found herself replaying every moment of that night. The touch of Lucas's hand, the tenderness in his kiss, the weight of his words. She had never expected this, never thought that at her age. She could feel so alive again, so desired, so seen. But as the initial rush of excitement faded, the reality of what had happened began to settle in. Clara couldn't help but think of the space between them. The years that stretched out like an invisible barrier, the decades that separated her life from his. She had always been the careful one, the one who measured everything, and now, suddenly, she felt reckless. She spent hours pondering what this connection with Lucas meant, reflecting on the years that had passed since her last serious relationship, the years that had molded her into the woman she had become. Was this some fleeting moment, a brief escape from the routine of her life? Or was it something deeper, something real, that could stand against time and all its judgments? Clara had learned long ago to guard her heart, to be careful with whom she entrusted her vulnerability. She had built walls around herself over the years, convinced that love was something for younger, bolder people, not someone in her 50s. But now, here she was, having crossed that line, stepping into a world where age was a mere number, and the emotions that surged within her felt as vibrant and intense as they ever had. She hadn't expected to fall for Lucas, but the more she thought about him, the clearer it became that her feelings for him weren't just a passing fancy. He made her feel seen and heard in a way she hadn't experienced in years, maybe never. His energy was infectious, his curiosity about her life refreshing. He didn't just treat her like someone's mother, someone's older acquaintance. He treated her like she mattered, like she was worth something beyond the years etched into her skin. Her thoughts spiraled, torn between the excitement of her feelings and the weight of societal expectations. What would people say? What would her friends think? Her family? Would they look at her like she was losing her grip on reality? The idea of judgment loomed over her, and she began to feel the familiar pull of doubt creep in. But as she sat on her porch one evening, sipping a cup of tea, Clara realized something. Love was never meant to be confined by age, or by the expectations others placed on it. It wasn't about how long she had lived or the number of years that separated them. It was about how they made each other feel. It was about the connection they shared, the way Lucas made her laugh, the way his presence made her feel young again, full of possibility. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. She closed her eyes and let the cool breeze wash over her, feeling at peace for the first time in a long while. The world might see her as too old for this kind of love, but Clara was no longer concerned with that. She wasn't here to live by anyone's rules but her own. Lucas had awakened something inside her, something she thought had been long buried. And as she thought about what came next, she no longer felt fear. Instead, she felt hope. Hope that love didn't belong to the young, that it didn't fade with age. Hope that, at 50-something, she could still have the kind of love that made her feel alive, that made her heart race. In that moment, Clara made a decision. She wouldn't hide from what she felt anymore. She wouldn't deny the joy that Lucas had brought into her life. She would embrace him, and let whatever was meant to happen unfold naturally. If the world had something to say about it, so be it. But Clara would no longer be bound by its expectations. Love in its purest form had no aged as the weeks passed. Clara and Lucas continued to spend time together, their bond deepening in ways neither had expected. Every moment with him felt like a new beginning, a fresh chapter in a life she had thought was nearing its end. They shared quiet dinners, spontaneous trips to the park, long walks under the stars. The connection between them grew stronger, a steady rhythm of companionship, affection, and something that resembled love, although Clara was still hesitant to name it. At first, she had been tentative, waiting for the inevitable moment when the weight of their age gap would come crashing down. But it never did. Every time they spoke, it became clearer to Clara that love wasn't defined by age, nor by anyone else's expectations. It was simply about how two people made each other feel, how they cherished one another, how they shared their hearts without fear of judgment. Clara found herself growing more confident in her decision. She stopped worrying about the whispers of society, the critical eyes of friends and family. She no longer cared if her relationship with Lucas was unconventional. What mattered was that it felt right. For the first time in years, she felt completely alive, her heart beating to a rhythm she hadn't known was possible at this stage of her life. And Lucas, with his easy smile and gentle ways, never once made her feel anything but cherished. He had become her companion in every sense of the word, a partner, a confidant, and a lover. His love was a quiet, constant presence in her life, one that made her feel seen, not for her age, but for who she truly was. One evening, as they sat together on her couch, sipping wine and talking about everything and nothing, Clara realized how far she had come. There was no more doubt, no more fear. She had allowed herself to love again, to step into a relationship that defied every expectation, and it had been the most rewarding decision she could have made. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice full of conviction, "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this right here, this feeling is worth everything. I'm not afraid anymore." He smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Neither am I, Clara." For the first time in ages, Clara felt truly free. Free from the confines of societal judgment. Free from the past, free to love without hesitation or fear. Love, it seemed, was a gift that didn't come with an expiration date. It was a gift that could bloom at any stage in life, in any form, without apology. And so, as the seasons changed and the world moved forward, Clara found herself walking a new path, one filled with love, discovery, and the quiet joy of a connection that was all her own. There were no rules anymore, no boundaries that she had to follow. She had learned that love, at its core, was simply about being seen, being accepted, and being open to whatever magic life had to offer. She had learned to love again, and this time, it was for herself and for him.